iGlobenews brings global views.
Welcome to another edition of iGlobenews Pods. If you like what you hear, please remember to like and subscribe to our channel and visit our website at www.iglobenews.org. The topic of today's show is Quality versus Quotas, Political Challenges to U.S. Law. Here to discuss this topic is Ilya Shapiro, a senior fellow and director of constitutional studies at the Manhattan Institute in New York. Before joining the Manhattan Institute, Mr. Shapiro was the executive director and a senior lecturer at the Georgetown Center for the Constitution and vice president of the Cato Institute. He served as director of Cato's Robert A. Levi Center for Constitutional Studies and published the Cato Supreme Court Review. He has authored numerous books on legal and constitutional topics and is a sought-after interview partner and expert in the U.S. Mr. Shapiro regularly lectures on behalf of the Federalist Society and is an adjunct professor at George Washington University and the University of Mississippi. You have degrees from the University of Chicago Law School, Princeton, and the London School of Economics. Ilya, welcome to our show.
It's great to be with you, and just a couple of weeks ahead of our law school reunion, our 20th. So look forward to seeing you there in person, Diana.
I'm very much looking forward to that as well. So let's start with your new book. You are an expert in constitutional law and are currently working on your book with the title Canceling Justice, the Illiberal Takeover of Legal Education. Why should Americans be concerned about this development, regardless of their political sympathies?
Right. Well, for decades, conservatives have had a complaint about the left-wing takeover of the Academy of Higher Education, going back to the 60s and the Berkeley Faculty Lounge or something like that. What we're seeing more recently is different than that, and I've characterized it as the illiberal takeover. That is, the traditional values of higher education, truth-seeking, teaching students, creation of knowledge, free speech, due process, all of these, you can call them classical liberal values, have been subverted in favor of a new ideological, radical orthodoxy. You can call it postmodern liberal, I suppose, neither classical nor modern, in that even those 60s era boomer liberals are afraid of their students and some of their younger colleagues, because these what came out of law schools, I think, critical legal studies, this idea that everything is viewed through the lens of race and sex. You view the value of what people are saying based on where they are in a hierarchy of intersectional privilege. This all sounds like gobbledygook from the Yale English department or something like this, but it's a very serious assault on education, on how young people are acculturated, and specifically with law schools, where I had a personal experience at Georgetown, as well as being a speaker in different places. After all, law schools are the places where the next generation of gatekeepers for our political and legal institutions are being trained. So if those classical values of the rule of law and due process and free speech are subverted, that's a real danger for society more broadly.
So do you think that law school students today aren't allowed to ask certain questions and are not allowed to be as critical as they were when we were in law school?
I would say that the ideological ratio hasn't changed that much. Kind of the spectrum of people, conservative, liberal, in the middle, libertarian, whatever, hasn't changed that much either among students or among faculty. But what has changed is indeed this campus climate. And our law school is one of the best, if not the best, for this. So it's an outlier. And in fact, the University of Chicago more broadly is the gold standard for adhering to free speech, non-ideological hiring, and other things that we can discuss. But in law schools more broadly, there's a great chilling effect. Campus climate surveys show this, that students, again, not just conservatives and libertarians, but everyone is walking on eggshells that you can't discuss certain topics, let alone take certain positions that are politically incorrect. It's toxic, it's unhealthy, and in the from the perspective of higher education, it really is counterproductive to the goal of educating, of in law schools teaching how to advocate and see different perspectives. It's really hugely challenging to the mission of these institutions.
So, would you say that there is an atmosphere of fear which prevails now?
I think that's right. Again, both among faculty and students, that if you say the wrong thing, your career is in jeopardy, your future is in jeopardy. Let alone, I'm not caring so much about whether students are going to be, invited to the right parties or something like that. That kind of social pressure, maybe that's secondary, because really what I'm caring about is the future of our institutions. And at a time of low institutional trust more broadly in American society, and I think there's certain dynamics like that in other countries around the world, as we're living in a populist moment where you have both the populism of the left and the right. How this is manifesting itself in higher education, and especially again in law schools, which to me is more concerning than what might happen in a department of sociology or anthropology, which is bad. But again, law schools are the next leaders of our institutions. And so, again and again, students and faculty, they try to keep their head down. They try to not opine on certain things, or even defend others who get caught in this type of cancel culture. It's really, some people talk about Orwell, and there's an aspect of that to DEI, the diversity, equity, inclusion, that we'll get to, or talk about the Nazis or Stalin or things like this, these extreme illustrations. But really, I think there's a parallel to Mao, the Chinese Cultural Revolution, where you have struggle sessions, you have throwing out old values to be replaced with something different. It really is unrecognizable to those of us who are in law school only 20 years ago. Again, this is not about, back in the old days, 100 years ago, 50 years ago. This is really a rapid change that has happened within the last decade.
In your recent Wall Street Journal interview, you discussed how so called critical legal studies have become the new normal, especially at elite US law schools. How could you describe critical legal studies for the uninitiated, and why is it so dangerous for society? And also, how will this change law school education in the future?
Critical legal studies arose in the late 80s, early 90s, and professors like Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, and others uh, thought that the dominant institutions in our society were biased towards, white men generally, that there was a kind of a patriarchy and a white supremacist institutional design legacy of America's history. And we have to look at legal institutions and legal rules not just for what they say on their text, but you look at the subtext and you look at things through the relationship of oppressor versus oppressed classes, and the hidden meaning of different words and biases, prejudices built into the way that the law has evolved. In America, we've heard a lot of talk lately in K to 12 education about critical race theory, and whether that's being taught in our schools, and especially during the pandemic and with the killing of George Floyd, how all of these kind of racialist theories, how they've come in. Well, critical race theory is one subset of critical legal studies. There are also gender and sex-based, class-based modes of analysis. It's very much I've mentioned this kind of a postmodern theory, building on Marcuse, building on Gramsci, Foucault, lots of these theorists and philosophers of the mid 20th century that have come out through law schools in a way of looking at institutions and the development of the law in a way that's different than either classical legal studies or even legal realism. That is the idea that the most law at the highest levels is just implementing public policy. Again, this is saying that the institutions themselves, the law itself, is illegitimate in various ways and needs to be reformed by taking into account being more conscious about race, sex, gender, class, these other ways by which people are underprivileged or discriminated against.
So, in a way, having these thoughts is maybe not the problem. It's the dogmatic implementation by certain groups in society, because it should be possible to just think about these certain groups and how it would affect society. But it's another thing to make it into a dogma, which is maybe what's happening in many public spheres now.
I think that's right. I mean, it shouldn't be outlawed to teach or learn about different kinds of theories. Read Karl Marx. Read, I don't think Mein Kampf should be banned from universities if you want to study how extremist movements could come about and things like this. In America, we have a robust First Amendment protection, certainly at public institutions, and parallel policies in private ones as well. But precisely the problem is that what we've seen is the growth of bureaucratic, non-teaching structures that do put in ideological dogma, as they say, as you say, with training, with the way that hiring is done, the way that campus culture or values are instilled in students. And it's this non-teaching staff, the bureaucratization of higher ed and including law schools, that I think has been captured by these postmodern illiberal trends that I think is responsible for both the shutdowns of speakers that we've seen on law school campuses, and the chill of the thinking and the speaking about certain issues that you and I have just discussed.
Those in favor of critical race theory say that it is a way of understanding how American racism has shaped public policy and options for non-white persons. And those against CRT argue that it is a divisive discourse that pits people of color against white people. So it's very emotional on both fronts. Do you see any way of bridging this gap, or will CRT change society in all?
Yeah, it's a big battle ranging again in the K to 12 educational space, as parents during the pandemic saw through Zoom school and otherwise what their kids were teaching and how a lot of these theories were poisoning their minds in various ways. Teaching elementary school kids to look at each other by race and to talk about their privilege and dividing people rather than uniting them, or rather than saying, this is bad and this is our history. Learn the history, but this is our values instead. These racialist and other prisms that have been used to teach, I think, are not healthy. In the law school space, again, I think we should be sensitive to certainly ways in which the law or political or legal actors might be perpetuating negative aspects of our history with regard to racism or otherwise, but to view everything through a perspective of who's the oppressor and who's the oppressed in any given exchange, or who has more privilege and who has less, and how do you check that privilege when you're evaluating a bankruptcy case or a contractual dispute. I think that can only pervert the law and ultimately give more power to those who are in power. I think these postmodern ways, critical race theory, critical legal studies, I think it hurts the very people it's designed to help, and it tribalizes society. It puts in a might makes right rule by the mob. Not good. None of these are good things. And I think it's part and parcel of our populist moment, I suppose. In the real world, you have illiberalism of both the left and the right, but in higher education, it's all coming from the left.
And everything starts with the words you're allowed to use and which are considered acceptable, which brings me to the Stanford University, a list of elimination of harmful language initiative website, where they banned words like American, brave, survivor, victim, addicted, among many other words. And they finally had to take it down because there was so much opposition from all sides. They took it down in January. But is speech control where we're headed?
We've had speech codes in the past, and I'm sort of working through this section of my book actually right now. We've had political correctness in the past. There were articles and books. I went to college in the early 90s and law school in the I went to high school in the early 90s, college in the late 90s, and there was even a movie called PCU, Politically Correct University. Some of the things they portray there would now be seen as tame, I think. But control of speech, as Orwell wrote, is the first step in terms of control of society. And so part of that is using positive or neutral words and transforming them to mean something else. You mentioned these kind of traditional descriptive words. I think other things on that list were things like merit or academic rigor. All of these are disfavored because somehow they're racist or they produce disparate impact on different racial groups or something like this. But really, it's subverting the way that we evaluate education. It's going against equal opportunity, instead in favor of equality of outcome. Kurt Vonnegut had a short story called Harrison Bergeron, where in any given sphere of human activity or achievement, those who are the best need to be hobbled so that everyone is equalized, whether that's dancers who get weights added to their feet, or thinkers who wear these earphones that distract and interrupt their thought processes, or otherwise. It's At the end of the day, it's um, using these positive ideas. Diversity, equity, inclusion is very hot in America, but and nobody can object to those words. I mean, it sounds good. We want people from different perspectives. We want to be fair to everyone. We want everyone to feel welcome at their school, at their workplace, etc. But those words have been subverted to be against intellectual diversity, to be inequitable, or rather to go for equal outcome rather than equal opportunity, and thereby they, rather than including, they exclude those who deviate from a radical orthodoxy. So yeah, control of words, control of language, and certainly for lawyers and law students, the law is all about language, and so whoever can control that or change its meaning will be very powerful long term.
In the Wall Street Journal article, you described how professional ideologues, together with academic bureaucrats, have set out to change the constitutional system, and that this poses a grave and long-term threat to, quote, the rule of law and inalienable rights, and even concepts like equal treatment under the law, end of quote. Could you elaborate what this means and give an example of how the ideologues and academic bureaucrats are working to change the US constitutional system?
Um, this goes from, I guess, a popular theorist, so-called anti-racist theorist, Ibram Kendi, who's gotten a lot of money and accolades, and basically says that you can't be anti-racist without taking race into account, without being racialist. And what used to be simply a matter of putting quotas on everything, that you have to, when you're hiring people or picking people for prizes or something like this, it has to be racially balanced, is now making its way into government as well, with effectively political commissars being assigned throughout the government. President Biden has issued executive orders regarding so-called equity, that all actions in every agency have to be vetted for their impact on equity, and equity means equality of outcome. So it doesn't matter if someone is the most qualified for a given job. We need to make sure that traditionally underrepresented minority groups are in there, and that public policies, even if there's no credible allegation that they're racist or sexist or homophobic or something, if they have an impact that disproportionately affects a particular group, depending on how it's defined, then that's improper. It's running all of government through these kinds of racialist and gender focused and gender identity based lenses, and it balkanizes society based on these various characteristics, such that you have different groups lobbying the government to be characterized as another one of these groups that can get favors from the government or from administrators at the universities, based on these characteristics.
So in effect, everything makes much more of a difference maybe than the qualifications that you bring. Is that a fair statement, or is that
That's
also
right.
put into the equation?
Yeah, no, the idea is that we have to expand our definition of qualification or merit, or the idea of merit itself is implicates certain biases that don't take into account the wealth of background that someone from a different race might be bringing, and to the extent that so-called objective measures don't yield the politically correct type of social balance based on race and sex and gender and et cetera, then they themselves are illegitimate and need to be thrown out. That's why there's been a move to go away from standardized tests, the SAT for undergrad, the LSAT for law schools, because the argument goes they don't produce as high scores for different racial groups, even though the whole function of those standardized tests was to provide opportunities to students who went to underprivileged schools, because it's hard to compare GPAs or educational opportunities across high schools or across colleges. But if you're doing well on these standardized tests, then that shows that can find those diamonds in the rough that otherwise get lost. But we're going against that now, and in effect, what these movements are doing is giving more privilege points to. It's all among the upper middle classes. So you're giving preference to various racial minorities among the upper and upper middle classes against anyone from lower socioeconomic areas.
Which brings me to a very interesting case. The US Supreme Court will decide in June on the challenge to affirmative action at Harvard and the University of North Carolina. Harvard and the UNC are accused of discriminating against Asian American students by using a subjective standard to gauge traits such as likability, courage, and kindness, and by effectively creating a ceiling for them in admission. Justin Driver, a law school professor at Yale, stated that, quote, these two cases unmistakably pose the gravest threat to the affirmative action's continued vitality. And many commentators are predicting the court's conservative supermajority will put an end to affirmative action. How do you see this decision going, and how will it impact education and other areas in society?
So let's be clear. This case is about university admissions. It's not
Yes.
about hiring. It's not about anything outside the university. There's other jurisprudence about that. For about 40 years now, over 40 years, starting with a 1978 case out of the University of California, um, the Supreme Court has said that you can consider race as one of many factors in admissions for purposes of educational diversity. So that was a curious case, the Bakke case, where four justices would have said that you can't consider race at all, and four said that you can consider it broadly as a remedy for centuries of discrimination, segregation, etc. But that one justice, Justice Powell, who was the swing vote, said you can consider it as long as it's not determinative, one of many factors for the purposes of diversity. And so that's why, even though most people who advocate for racial preferences want to do it out of a sense of racial balancing or to remedy past wrongs, they're forced to argue out of this diversity criterion. Even though it's unclear that that racial preferences have created a better understanding of people from different backgrounds or what have you, and it's been very difficult to apply in practice. Schools are encouraged to have kind of a black box where nobody knows exactly how race goes into consideration, because the Supreme Court does not allow mechanical quotas or a certain number of points attached to race, like you attach a certain number of points to someone who's an award-winning violinist or an Olympic athlete or something like this. And so this case, one with the oldest public university in the country, North Carolina, one with the oldest private university, Harvard. And the reason that private universities are involved is because they receive federal funding. And under the relevant statutes, those who receive federal education funding have to play by the same rules, at least for these purposes, as public universities. And almost certainly now, 45 years after the Bakke case, the Supreme Court has said this experiment has failed. There's no way that race can be used in an administrable way. And moreover, there's all of these negative effects that only the wealthy are benefiting from it. You're advantaging the black kids of doctors and lawyers and punishing the poor white kids, and especially Asians now, because these challenges have been brought by Asian Americans. There seem to have been caps on the number of Asian American students at Harvard, kind of like what happened with Jewish students 100 years ago. Nasty stuff. And so it's likely that the Supreme Court will will say that it's not constitutional to use race anymore. So the question is, what will schools do? Will they try to get at race some other way by using zip codes, by using underperforming schools? Will they turn to socioeconomic preferences instead to try to capture the same thing? Or will they simply engage in massive resistance to the Supreme Court ruling, just like southern states engaged in massive resistance to orders to desegregate in the 50s and 60s? There's going to be a lot of controversy over this, certainly, and the move of schools, both law schools and universities more broadly, to withdraw from U.S. News rankings. The U.S. News is a magazine that traditionally has every year ranked colleges, law schools, medical schools, etc. And now most schools have withdrawn from providing certain private information to U.S. News. So U.S. News has changed its ranking methodology, only using publicly available sources. Anyway, this is getting into the weeds, but the commentary is, the thinking is that these schools are preparing to try to still use racial preferences, even if, as is expected, the Supreme Court says that that's no longer legal. So it's very messy, but unlike other controversies, like, say, abortion, that the Supreme Court decided last year, this issue of racial preferences, while it's seen as kind of controversial among elites, among Americans as a whole, it's about 3-1 against the use of racial preferences. And that includes majorities of African Americans, Hispanics, Democrats, even. The extent to which, if the Supreme Court rules as it's expected, and you'll see American media and international media portraying this as some huge controversy. In the American populace as a whole, that kind of decision, I think, is going to be welcomed.
So you think that there's a difference between the elites in these schools and maybe the American public in general, how they will accept this decision, but maybe the bottom line is that nothing will change much, even if it goes against them. Is that where you see this headed?
Well, the schools are overwhelmingly in favor of using racial preferences, but elites more broadly are split. In the media, in the professional elites of various kinds. Um, the What the schools will do is going to be the subject of controversy, and I'm sure there will be lawsuits. As I hope that different schools experiment with different methods. What is it that you're trying to do? Are you trying to find students that otherwise would be overlooked? By the time someone is applying to law school or medical school, you would think that it's too late to compensate in some way. I mean, will universities start doing more with K to 12 schools to make sure that there are more kids in the pipeline that are qualified to go into the elite schools, or what have you? I mean, the thing is about this whole debate over so-called affirmative action is that only about 20 or 25% of colleges in the country, I mean, setting aside law schools, but colleges, four-year universities, only about 20 or 25% are selective, meaning most schools, you apply, you get in. Harvard is different, obviously. UNC is different. It's one of the elite public schools. But for most Americans to this day still don't go to college. And among those that do, most of them go to places where this isn't an issue because everybody gets in if you apply. So this is very much a conversation among elites. And once the Supreme Court rules, we'll see what clever ways some schools will try to do to evade it, or will they try to pursue some other kind of goal?
But of course, in the US, it's very important where you go to school, for our international audience out
Well,
there.
I think it's important everywhere. I mean, and in Austria, I'm sure there are schools that are more prestigious than others, and
Well, we
but
have
but
a
yeah.
different system here. It's like in Austria, the schools are University of Vienna is a state-sponsored school, and that's basically it's one of the oldest speaking German schools in Europe, in the world. We don't in Europe in general doesn't have this system of all these private schools. There are some, of course, but it's not as diverse, I would say, as you have it in the U.S.
Right. No, I mean, well, obviously, it's a larger country and all of that, but still, it could well be that I mean, it depends on the country. And in France, you have the certain schools where if you want
Yeah.
to go into public administration, you have to go to ENA, and if you want to go to Sciences Po is more ranked highly than some other schools. So, of course, there are going to be more prestigious schools in different countries and kind of pathways to certain types of careers. But yeah, in the U.S., this established Ivy League of 7 schools in the Northeast, plus Stanford in California and University of Chicago and others. The top 20 or 25 that are considered to be the elites. That does matter. Although it seems to be we're in a system of flux where a lot of companies are learning that you get that brand on the diploma, but it might not provide the best education. And so anyway, it's a topic of public discourse, the role that these elite schools play, and whether we need to think differently about higher education.
That's definitely being discussed now. And I think your book will certainly probably go into different venues and different models for the future. I wanted to now discuss a bit. You quit your job as executive director of the Center for the Constitution at Georgetown University's Law School because of the repercussions of your criticizing President Biden's pick to replace Justice Stephen Breyer. You stated that Georgetown administrators had created a, quote, hostile environment for you. And you basically were criticizing Biden's choice because it was based not on quality, but on a quota. And your case was nationally discussed, but surely not unique. There's the case of the UCLA professor Gordon Klein, who was suspended after he did not agree to grade Black students more leniently than non-Black students. And Maitland Jones Jr., a professor of organic chemistry, was fired from NYU after more than 80, mostly pre-med students from his 350 course signed a petition complaining about his grading too strictly. So where do you see this battle between equity versus equality going? And are we headed towards a society of mediocrity?
Yeah, that is the big question. Um, when I left Georgetown in June of last year, this was I had a few days before I was due to start there. I tweeted in a way that I've said all along was poorly phrased, but my point was to say that Biden should not have limited his selection pool by race and sex. But then I had 4 days of hell where it wasn't clear where I was going to be fired. And then I had four months of purgatory, to extend the analogy, where my tweet was investigated. It takes high-powered lawyers 4 months to investigate whether my tweet violated university policy, which also is very short. You'd think at a law school they could apply the law to the facts and be done with it one way or another, but no, it took that long. I was paid the whole time, so that was good. I was paid not to work. And then I was reinstated on the technicality that I was not yet an employee when I tweeted. But then when I got the report from the diversity office that investigated me, they made clear that anytime someone was offended by something I wrote or said, that would subject me to discipline. And so that is why I ultimately had to resign, and have been using this moment that I've been thrust into ever since to shine a light on the rot in academia. But if you'd asked me back then, last June or a few months later, when I joined the Manhattan Institute, I work from home in Falls Church, Virginia. By the way, I haven't moved to New York. But if you'd asked me back then, I'd be very pessimistic. I'd say we probably passed the point of no return in academia, even if I'm optimistic about society more broadly, as people see that the emperor has no clothes, that some of these illiberal things, that's just not the right way that we should be doing things. But just in the last few months, we've seen pushback in law schools and elsewhere. One opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal in January, February, by an investigative reporter who found documents through a public records request at Texas Tech University showing that they were hiring their biologists based on diversity statements and not by their merit. One op-ed. The next day, the president of the university said, "We're not doing that anymore. That's not appropriate." And you've seen examples like this here and there. So to mix metaphors, some of these structures may be Potemkin villages guarded by paper tigers. I think reform or change won't happen internally very hard. I think university leaders, deans, presidents, provosts have to be forced to do the right thing, in effect, by public attention, by exogenous shocks. For example, certain federal judges have announced they're not going to be hiring clerks from Yale or Stanford because of the bad climate relating to free speech and civil discourse at those elite schools. Employers might want to take a look. This judge a month and a half ago who was tried to speak at Stanford and was shouted down, including people shouting things like, "We hope your daughters are raped." Is that the sort of thing that this kind of lawyer that an employer wants to hire? The Texas Bar Association is now adding another question on their character and fitness investigation that all lawyers have to complete to become members of the bar. Have you ever been subject to discipline or had problems with civility and disruption of events at your school? So gradually, there are external pressures. Alumni are concerned about what's going on at their school. So maybe we're in the eye of the storm. It's hard to know where we're going to go, but I'm a little more optimistic now than I was 6 or 9 months ago.
Were these students at Stanford actually, was there a list of them? Or because to be able to put them on a list, you'd have to know who they were beforehand.
Well, there's video. There's video. And there could be an investigation, although the official video that Stanford released blurred their faces, but there is unredacted video is available as well.
So that brings us back to our first question. We were talking about freedom of expression and being allowed to just hold a discourse with people who maybe don't hold your opinions. Which brings me to a topic, one of our last topics, which definitely goes down this road, namely former President Donald Trump, who is now the only current or former president to be indicted. And while those on the left are completely ecstatic about what's going on, many are warning that this is a very dangerous precedent, including those who are really no big fans of President Trump. In your opinion, how strong is this case against the president? And do you see this indictment against a former president affecting the U.S. legal system going forward?
Isn't it possible to have a media interview without talking about Donald Trump anymore?
If you don't want to answer it, that's fine too.
No. Look, this, the only precedent that's even in the ballpark is one time. This is a curious piece of trivia for you. Ulysses S. Grant was once pulled over and detained for speeding in his horse and buggy in the late 1860s. The indictment in New York is the weakest possible case of all of the various investigations of Donald Trump. There are investigations in Georgia about violating election laws, trying to defraud the election processes there. There are federal investigations about mishandling of classified documents, certain other things in other places. This indictment for effectively an accounting error that he used his business funds to pay off the porn star with whom he was allegedly having an affair, and didn't record them properly as a business expense, or improperly recorded them as a business expense, which then violated campaign finance rules because he was running for president. I mean, first of all, the statute of limitations has long run, and to avoid that, there has to be a felony attached. It's unclear. I mean, the only reason why this has been reopened is, of course, because he's again running for president. This same prosecutor, let alone others, had previously declined to prosecute. There's a lot of problems with this particular investigation. And I think it only benefits two people. Donald Trump, he's now more popular among the Republican primary electorate because he's besieged and they have to rally around him. And Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan prosecutor, who now I think sets himself well for the Democratic primary the next time he runs for something. I don't know what he's going to run for, but it's good for him personally. I think it's a negative for America more broadly. It makes it more likely that Donald Trump will be the Republican nominee for president, less likely that he wins in the general election, and less likely that any of the other more substantively valid investigations are perceived as legitimate. So, because this one is farcical, the next ones that may have more substance to them will also be perceived as being political and illegitimate. And so, this is a bad development all around, and sets the precedent for future Republican administrations. All of a sudden, prosecutors are going to look to go after former Democratic officials. It makes America into a banana republic.
So it's dividing rather than bringing the two sides together. So while America is deciding which bathrooms people can use and which gender pronouns are the correct ones so that you don't offend anybody, China is solidifying its position as a coming or maybe already present superpower and is expanding its power base. So will this cultural war weaken the US dominance?
Well, I think the cultural war is already weakening America. People have written, America will never be conquered from without. It's only a loss of will, a loss of nerve from within. If more and more people don't believe in the American idea, don't believe in our structures of government, and think it's only, we need to install our own autocrat who does battle with the other side's autocrat, that's not good for society. And as I said, levels of social trust, institutional trust, are already low. So the inflaming of these illiberal dynamics are not helpful. And yeah, China certainly benefits from that. I'm sure China is involved, as has been, Vladimir Putin in campaigns not to benefit either political party, but to sow this mutual distrust within American society. Now, China has its own problems, including that it's getting old before it gets big. It's going to be shrinking. The one child policy and otherwise, it faces its own demographic challenges. Um, you know, what's going to happen if and when it makes a move for Taiwan? Unclear. The dollar is still the world's reserve currency, so it's not that people are saying, "Oh, all of a sudden, European society is what we should be modeling, or Japan, or something else." So, it's not that America is still okay relative to the rest of the world, but I think it's not good for the world at large for Americans to be having a crisis of confidence.
And the Chinese are chipping away at the predominance of the dollar as we speak.
Well, I'm a simple constitutional lawyer. Don't come to me for financial analysis.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Ilya. This was a really very, very interesting discussion. Thank you for answering all our questions candidly. And it was great having you on our show. And for all our listeners out there, thank you for tuning in to another episode of iGlobe News Pods, and tune in to more pods to come. Thank you very much.